All right, strap yourselves in because today we are going to be diving deep into a topic that might just completely flip what you think you know about Australia's tax system.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff.
You've probably heard that Aussies are just slammed with income tax, like paying way more than in most other developed countries.
Yeah.
But is that really true?
Hmm.
Get ready for some serious myth busting because we're going deep into a report from the Australia Institute.
Yeah.
They're an independent think tank, so no political agenda or anything there that challenges this pretty common belief.
Right.
And they challenge it with some pretty compelling data.
Yeah, what I think is really fascinating about this report is that it doesn't just look at Australia on its own.
Hmm.
It compares our tax system to 37 other developed countries.
Okay.
In the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, basically a club of countries with similar economies and standards of living.
Right, right.
So it's all about understanding where Australia fits in the global tax landscape.
Okay, so let's get to the juicy stuff.
Yeah.
The report starts by looking at the big picture. How much tax does Australia collect overall compared to these other countries?
Hmm.
And hold on to your hats because the finding right out of the gate is pretty surprising.
Yeah, it is.
Australia actually has the 9th lowest tax to GDP ratio among all those OECD nations.
That's right, 9th lowest.
9th lowest.
Which means that if you think of GDP like a country's total income,
Right.
Australia is only taking a relatively small slice of that income in taxes.
Hmm.
In fact, only 8 other countries collect less tax relative to the size of their economies.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's a bit of a reality check, isn't it?
it is.
It sounds like that whole Australia's a high-tax country narrative might need a serious rethink.
Maybe.
But wait, before we get ahead of ourselves, we need to address the elephant in the room, I guess.
Sure.
Income tax.
Right.
Even if our overall tax burden is low, what about the argument that we rely too much on income tax specifically?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something the report tackles head on. You see, simply comparing how much of our total tax revenue comes from income tax, it can be a bit misleading.
Okay.
Let's take Belgium and Australia as examples.
Yeah.
Belgium has a much higher overall tax burden compared to the OECD average,
Right.
while Australia, as we've seen, is down the lower end.
Mm-hmm.
But if you just look at the percentage of tax revenue that comes from income tax, Australia actually seems much higher than Belgium.
So what's going on there? Is Belgium secretly giving away tax breaks while we're all sweating over our income tax returns?
Not quite. The reason for this seeming contradiction is that Belgium collects a lot more in other types of taxes.
Hmm.
So their income tax portion looks smaller proportionally.
Yeah.
It's like comparing apples and oranges, really.
So it's all about the baseline.
Yeah.
Using GDP to compare overall tax burdens gives us a much clearer picture because it accounts for all the different ways countries collect revenue.
Right. Precisely. And this brings us to a really crucial point, the concept of Social Security contributions,
Okay.
or SSCs for short.
Right.
Now, this is where things get interesting.
Okay, so SSCs, these are those taxes on wages that many other OECD countries use to fund things like unemployment benefits, healthcare, and pensions.
Right, exactly.
Kind of like Social Security in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. And here's the thing. Australia and New Zealand are the only OECD countries that don't have SSCs.
Oh, wow.
This is a big deal when we're talking about income tax burdens because, you see, when the OECD compares how much tax workers pay, they include SSCs along with income tax.
Mm.
It's all part of the same pot of money, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
So when people in Australia are complaining about relying too much on income tax, they're often leaving out this, like, whole other sorts of revenue.
They are, yeah.
That's pretty standard in most other developed countries.
Right.
It's like we're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And this missing piece can really distort the picture. Remember how we talked about using GDP as the baseline for a fairer comparison?
Yes.
Well, the same logic applies here.
Okay, I'm starting to see where you're going with this.
Good.
So what happens to Australia's ranking when we factor in those hypothetical SSCs?
Yeah.
Does it change things dramatically?
Yeah, it really does, yeah. When you add in hypothetical SSCs to the mix, basically pretending Australia has a system like most other countries, We actually dropped from ninth lowest to seventh lowest in the OECD for income tax burden.
Wow, okay, that is a huge shift.
It is.
Suddenly, Australia doesn't look so bad on the income tax front after all.
Yeah.
But wait, I know you're thinking it. What about superannuation?
Of course. Yeah.
Doesn't that come into play here?
Yeah, you're right. That's the next logical question.
Yeah.
Some people would argue that Australia's compulsory superannuation system is essentially another form of tax.
Right.
But the report kind of pushes back on this idea. They argue that superannuation is fundamentally different because it's a forced savings scheme
Okay.
where the money ultimately belongs to you and it's returned to you when you retire.
So the money in your super account is still your money, even though you're forced to save it.
That's right.
It's not going straight to the government to fund public services like a tax does.
Exactly.
Interesting distinction.
Yeah.
But just for argument's sake, what if we did include superannuation in that tax burden calculation? Would it bump Australia back up the rankings?
It would, yeah. But not by that much. Even if we add superannuation to Australia's tax burden, we only move up to 11th lowest in the OECD.
Okay.
Still lower than many countries often cited as having lower tax burdens, like Canada, the UK, the US, and even Switzerland.
Wow.
And it's worth noting that many other OECD countries do have some form of compulsory retirement savings scheme, although comparing those apples to apples with Australia's superannuation system can get a bit tricky.
So even in this, hypothetical scenario where we treat super like a tax, Australia's overall tax burden, including what we might call income tax broadly, remains relatively low compared to other developed nations.
That's right, exactly. And this kind of leads us to a really important question that the report doesn't shy away from.
Go on.
If Australia is actually a relatively low-tax country by OECD standards, what are the implications for funding those essential services and programs?
Right.
You know, healthcare, education, infrastructure, all those things that contribute to our quality of life.
That's a big one. If we're not collecting as much tax revenue as other developed countries, it stands to reason that something has to give, right?
It does, yeah.
Are we potentially underfunding vital areas, or are there hidden costs to keeping taxes so low?
It's a really complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
There's no doubt that lower taxes can be attractive, especially for individuals and businesses. It can potentially boost economic activity and make Australia a more attractive place to invest. But there's a flip side to that coin as well.
I'm guessing the flip side is that lower taxes means less money for the government to work with, which could lead to cuts in public services or a bigger government debt, or maybe even both.
You got it. It's all about finding that that sweet spot, that balance between a tax system that supports economic growth without compromising the well-being of Australians.
Right.
And this report from the Australia Institute highlights the fact that if Australia simply raised its tax to GDP ratio to the OECD average, remember that's the average amongst all those other developed countries, we'd have an extra $105 billion in government revenue every year.
Wow.
Just let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah.
$105 billion.
That's mind-blowing.
It is, isn't it?
It really puts things into perspective.
It does. That's enough to build a whole bunch of new hospitals, fund years of free university tuition, or invest heavily in renewable energy. It really underscores the importance of having a well-informed and nuanced discussion about tax policy in Australia.
This deep dive isn't just about debunking a myth. It's about prompting us to think about what kind of society we want to live in and how we're going to pay for it, right?
You hit the nail on the head. And this is where you, the listener, come in.
Okay.
Now that you have a clearer understanding of where Australia stands in the global tax landscape, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think our current system is striking the right balance, or do we need to rethink our approach to taxation to ensure the long-term well-being of Australia?
There are no right or wrong answers here. It's about weighing the pros and cons, considering different perspectives, and engaging in constructive dialogue about what's best for Australia's future.
Absolutely.
We've just scratched the surface in this deep dive.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to explore in the full report from the Australia Institute. You can find a link to the full report in the show notes.
Don't just take our word for it. Dive into the data, weigh the arguments, and form your own conclusions.
Exactly. This is your chance to become a tax expert. And most importantly, share your thoughts. We'd love to hear what resonates with you, what challenges your assumptions, and what questions this deep dive has sparked. Join the conversation online using the hashtag #TheDeepDiveTax.
Because understanding our tax system is the first step towards shaping a future that works for all Australians.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
But the conversation doesn't end here. So we've covered a lot of ground today. But I think the big takeaway here is that the common narrative surrounding Australia's tax system, particularly this idea that we're like grounding an income tax, just doesn't hold water when you look at the facts.
Yeah, you know what I find so interesting is how this misconception has taken root despite the evidence to the contrary. It really highlights the power of framing and how easily we can be swayed by certain narratives,
Right.
even when they're not completely accurate.
It's a perfect example of why we do what we do here on the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We want to give you the tools to think critically about the information you encounter every day, to look beyond the headlines and sound bites and really dig into the data.
Because let's face it, we're bombarded with information these days, and it's not always easy to sort out,
Yeah.
to separate fact from fiction.
It's tough.
Yeah, that's why critical thinking is more important now than ever.
Absolutely. And this deep dive into Australia's tax system shows just how easily we can be misled by incomplete or biased information.
Yeah, for sure.
So as you go about your day, we encourage you to keep this in mind.
Yeah.
Question those assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, because the truth is often much more complex than we might initially think.
Definitely, and that's where the real learning begins.
Absolutely.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question.
Okay.
We've seen that Australia actually collects less tax than many other developed countries.
Right.
If we brought our tax-to-GDP ratio up to that OECD average, we'd have an extra $105 billion each year to invest in services and programs. What would you prioritize if you had a say in how that money was spent?
Oh, that's a great question to ponder.
Yeah.
It really gets to the heart of the values and priorities we have as a society. What do we want to invest in? What kind of future do we want to build for Australia?
That's it for this deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here. We hope it inspires you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the issues that matter.
Because knowledge is power, and informed citizens are the foundation of a strong and vibrant democracy.
Well said.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and remember, there's always more to learn